Do you want to build a PC but have no idea where to start? Let's build one together. What's going on, guys? My name is Kyle and welcome back to the game department. Today, we're going to build a PC. I've wanted to make this video for such a long time and we're only finally getting around to it. We've got all the parts that we need and we're going to do our best to run through it step by step in the easiest way possible. When I built my first PC, obviously I had no idea about anything that I was doing. So I want to try and explain and show you the easiest way to do it, even if you have no idea about anything to do with computers. So the first thing we're gonna do is go through all of the components. I'm gonna show you the case that we've picked out, run you through everything that we need, and we're just gonna make a start. Don't get overwhelmed, it's gonna be fine. So let's go through all of the stuff that we have ready to go to use today. We have our graphics card, we have a motherboard, we have our RAM, our NVMe M.2, which is gonna be our storage on this build. We have a power supply, we have our CPU, and we have a case in the back there. That's it, that's all we need. If you don't know what some of these components do, that is okay, don't stress. I'll leave some links in the description that'll go more in depth as to what each component does and hopefully help you explain it a little bit better. So step one, we're gonna clear the space off. We're gonna grab our motherboard. We're gonna install our CPU and our CPU cooler, also our RAM. I'm gonna get that all on there ready to go so we can mount it straight into our case, and that's majority of the work done. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's clear up the desk. Now, one thing I do want to mention is there are a couple of tools that will make this job a hell of a lot easier. I definitely suggest you go and grab yourself one of these. This is a static bracelet, and what this will do is it'll help get rid of all that static energy that your body builds up and disperse it and get it away from your components, which is definitely something you want to do. I don't really like to use this on my wrist because I feel like the cable gets in the way when I'm trying to get in and do stuff. So what I like to do is actually put this one around my ankle and then clip this one to the power supply grill itself. You don't need to turn it on. You don't need to do anything with the power supply other than run a cable into the back of it, just so it's grounded, and it will help disperse all of that energy. That's the first thing. The second thing is one of these nice little cases. This is a little PC repair kit. Comes with a screwdriver as well as a bunch of different bits that will help with the build. This is not necessary. You might find tools, or you might already have tools that will do these jobs. I like to have it in this nice little case. It keeps it nice and organized and clean, and it's there, and it's ready, and it's organized, which is the most important part because I'm not a very organized person. So let's have a look at our motherboard. Today, we're gonna be using a Gigabyte B450 Gaming X. This is part of a bundle that I got with the CPU and the RAM. It's just a cheap entry-level gaming motherboard. It'll do exactly what we need this PC to do and not go over the top, which is fine. So fortunately today, we have the help of our overhead rig, which is gonna give you guys a nice look as to what's inside the boxes, how the components come, and what you need to do with a bit of a better angle than what I can show you in this camera. So let's go ahead and let's open up this motherboard box and I'll show you what you get inside. When you open your motherboard, you're gonna have your motherboard inside this little static sleeve. What I like to do is I like to close the motherboard box, put that sleeve on the top, put the motherboard on top like this, being nice and careful not to hit anything or break anything off the motherboard. And there you go, you have a static-free workstation to start building a PC. So if this is your first time looking at a motherboard, I'll show you exactly where stuff goes before we start putting stuff in. It just might help make things a little bit easier for you to understand. So this little square here, this is where your CPU goes. CPUs differ from AMD or Intel chips. They are different, so definitely check what format your motherboard is. There's no point having an AMD motherboard and an Intel CPU because the CPU won't fit the socket. Moving just across from the CPU, you have your RAM DIMMs, which are these 4 channels right here. Some will have more, some will have less. This one has 4, and that is where our RAM will seat and slip into those slots, but I'll show you that when it comes to it. Moving down to the opposite side of the motherboard, you have your PCIe slots. Now, these are the slots that you would generally put Wi-Fi cards, internal capture cards. Your graphics card will go into one of these slots as well. The PCIe will use a bunch of different things. Today, we're gonna use it to do our graphics card. In between the 2 PCIe slots is this tiny little rectangle here. I don't know how easy that is to see on the camera, but this is your M.2 slot. So that NVMe that we bought earlier, which is gonna be our main storage on this computer, that slots into this M.2. I'll show you how that all mounts later on. Now moving down to the outer edge of the motherboard, you have all of these individual little slots with pins. Now what these are for are your USB 3, your HD audio, your power switch for your system. This bottom row does a bunch of different things. I won't go into detail about exactly what they do, but when it comes to connecting all of the cables, I'll explain a little bit further as to what goes where and how you actually insert them all. On the outer edge of the motherboard where the RAM sits, you have this 24 pin slot, which is like these little ones here, it's just much bigger. What this is your main power for your motherboard or your 24 pin connector. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but when it comes time to hook that up, I'll explain exactly how to do it. Last but not least, going to the exact opposite side of the motherboard, you have your back I/O. This is where you have your Ethernet connection, all of your USB connections, your onboard HDMI, everything that you plug into your computer generally gets plugged into the back I/O of your motherboard, which is right here. And moving just up from that is this 8-pin connector here, which is what powers your CPU. And that's it. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna put our CPU in, we're gonna get our CPU cooler on, and we're gonna install our RAM, and then this is gonna be ready for us to set aside. So the CPU that I'm using on this build is a Ryzen 5 3500X. I really like the AMD Ryzen stuff. It's all personal preference. Some CPUs will suit you better. It's completely dependent on what you like. If you're unsure about what you want to go for in a CPU, definitely ask somebody at a computer shop and try and do as much research online as you can. So inside the box, you're gonna have the CPU itself, which is in its own little plastic cover. And with this CPU, it comes with its own cooler. So this is the AMD Wraith cooler, and I'm gonna use this one on the build solely for the fact that it's what comes with the CPU. So I feel like it's easier just to use what comes with the CPU and make it a little bit more realistic to people that are building PCs for the very first time. So this is what your CPU cooler will look like. It has screws on the back, and it has a pad here that actually makes contact with your CPU, and that's what draws the heat out of the actual chip. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab our CPU, and on our motherboard here, you're gonna see there's a tiny little tab. You wanna pull this bar aside and lift it up and over. You'll see that one just there. If you're unsure, it's right here on this side of the CPU socket. You wanna open that up, and what it does is it makes this slot ready for the chip to be inserted. You can't insert the chip when it's down like this because that's the closed position. You need it to be in the open position. So we're gonna flick that latch up. We're gonna grab our CPU. Now, if you've never installed a CPU on a motherboard before, the one thing you wanna look out for is on one of the corners of the CPU, you're gonna see a tiny little triangle. I don't know how easy you're gonna be able to see that on this camera, but there's gonna be a tiny triangle in one of the corners of the CPU. When you look at your motherboard, you'll have a look in every corner, and you'll see that one of the corners actually has the same triangle in orientation. In our case, it's actually printed on this corner of the motherboard itself, so that's the way that the chip needs to sit. And all you wanna do is just seat that chip in, it'll slide right in. You wanna be nice and careful because they can damage the pins on the bottom of the CPU. Just take your time, be nice and slow with it. There's no issue with that at all. Once it's in, this is a kind of scary part, and I know the first time you do it, you feel like you're doing something wrong. Once your CPU is slotted in, you wanna grab that bar, you wanna push it all the way down. You will feel a little bit of pressure and then lock it in. That's it. Now that that's done, we're gonna install our cooler. Now before we install our cooler, what we need to do is put some thermal paste on the top of the CPU. If you don't have thermal paste, you can buy it online, you can buy it in any different computer shop. If you're not sure which thermal paste to go for, because there are so many different kinds out there, just ask the question, ask somebody in the shop that you're buying the stuff from. Everyone has their own opinions, but just go for something that's gonna do the job. So when you're applying thermal paste, people say there's a bunch of different ways to do it. I just like to make a little Y shape on top of the CPU, just to try and give as much even coverage as you can. You don't have to do it that way. You can just put a tiny little pea-sized blob on top of the CPU. It's totally up to you. I'm gonna do it as a Y, so I'll show you how to do that. All you need is just to put a little amount. You don't need a huge amount of the thermal paste because it will smear out once you put the CPU cooler on. That's it. That's all you need. If you put too much thermal paste on, what will happen is when you put your CPU cooler on, it'll smear out of the sides, just not be good for the CPU at all. So I probably should have done this first, but there's two little black hooks on either side of this motherboard. I don't want them on there, I want to take them off. So all I'm gonna do is just unscrew each screw on either side. I'm gonna take those little pieces off, and that way my cooler is just gonna go straight on top of that piece there. Great, so we've undone those screws, those pieces come off. Now our CPU cooler is gonna sit right on top and screw into those little holes that we've left from taking those pieces out. One thing to note is your CPU cooler does have a cable running off it, and it does need to be plugged into the motherboard to power the fan itself. So you wanna try and make sure you can find a CPU header fan or a header port. It'll say CPU fan or CPU header, something along those lines near where the CPU is, and you wanna just try and hide it and make it nice and neat without it looking too busy. So I'm going to do that now. So unfortunately, the way that the CPU cooler is, I need to have the cable coming from this direction, which means there's going to be a lot of slack. So I'll show you a way to alleviate that. But first, we're just going to put our CPU cooler on top of where our CPU is, line up the screws there, and then with a screwdriver, we're just going to screw those in. Now you want to just do a couple of turns on each point, and you want to add it in evenly. You don't want to be doing a bunch of turns on one corner and just make one corner super tight. You want to just try and do even pressure like you would when you're tightening the wheels on a car, just to make sure that there's even pressure across the entire CPU and there's no certain strain on one specific corner. Now we have to plug in this cable, but as I said before, there's so much slack. So what I like to do is make a really loose knot in the cable itself. You don't want to be pulling it tight or adding any strain to any of the connection sides of the cable. But now that you've got that slight little loop, you're just going to plug that into the CPU fan header, and there you go. It's nothing crazy, but it looks a hell of a lot neater than it did before. Perfect. Now let's move on to the RAM. I'm going to spin this motherboard this way. It might look a bit weird for you guys to see, but it'll make it a hell of a lot easier for me to put the RAM in. Now when you get your RAM for the first time, it's going to come in a little box, something similar to this. I've got a 16 gig pack. So it's 2 sticks of 18 gigabyte RAM. This is at 3200. Again, I'm not going to go into too much about what those things mean, but I will leave a bunch of links in the bottom for you to see exactly what those are. When you look at your RAM, this is what you're going to get. So as I said, I've got 2 sticks of 8. We're going to quickly open these up and show you how to install these RAM sticks. Now, when you look at your RAM for the first time, you are going to see that there's pins at the bottom and some sort of heatsink at the top. Some will have RGB strips. There'll be a bunch of different things for different kinds of RAM. Now, when you're looking down at the RAM, you'll see that there's a tiny little notch taken out of the bottom. Now, what that does is shows you the orientation of the way that the RAM is supposed to sit. Now, before you can put your RAM into the motherboard itself, you're going to have these little tabs on either side of where your RAM sits. You want to make sure that these tabs are flicked all the way down. You'll see exactly what I mean when you're looking at one. And you want to look at where that notch will line up inside the motherboard itself. So for me, the notch is further towards this side, which means when looking at the RAM, because the notch is further to this side, I want to make sure that I'm putting it in this way. Now that your RAM is sitting loosely into your RAM DIMM slot, you want to push down hard on one side until you hear a click. There you go. And you're going to do it on the other side. Don't think you're pressing too hard. It sometimes does take a little bit of force. If you feel like you are pushing to the point where you're going to break something, stop, reassess, have a bit of a look. But generally it takes a little bit more pressure than what you think it would. So you want to push this one down as well. Nice and flat. There you go. So this one's clicked in on both sides, which means this RAM has been installed successfully into that slot. We're going to do the same thing with the next stick. So again, you want to look for that notch, work out where the notch is in the actual motherboard itself. As I said, sometimes it takes a little bit more pressure than you think it will, but once they're in there, that's all good to go. Pack up your rubbish so you've got a clean workspace. And that's it. We now have a CPU cooler, and our RAM all installed, ready to go. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna get the case, we're gonna get everything ready to go to actually mount this motherboard into the case, and then we can start connecting things. Before I put this aside, I do wanna go into the box, and inside the motherboard box, you're gonna find a back I/O panel cover. It'll look something like the back of what your PC looks like. It looks something like this tiny little I/O shield. You wanna keep that one out, put everything else away, and just set your motherboard aside so we can get this case ready to go. Now the case that we're gonna be using is this old Cooler Master case. I've used this before on a previous build, so it might still have a little bit of dust going on. I do apologize. So before we get too far ahead, I'm gonna quickly run you through what is in where of the case. This is the front, this is the back. I have 3 fans set in the front of this case and 1 on the rear. And what this is gonna do is push all the air through the front, go over the top of the motherboard, and then be exhausted through the side here. Alternatively, you can put fans up the top here and push the air up, but for me, it's just gonna go straight through, straight out. That's the quickest and easiest way. This PC is not gonna be under too much stress, so it shouldn't be building up that much heat anyway, but if I find that it is getting super hot, we might put 2 fans up the top there just to sort of get rid of some of the heat out of the top. So when you open up a case for the first time, you are gonna see a couple of little things they're going to be stuck into the back of the case itself. These are called standoffs. So this is what the motherboard sits on top of, and that's what you actually mount it to. So motherboards have different sizes. You have an ATX, a micro ATX, and a mini ATX. Anything with an A is where your motherboard is going to sit if it's an ATX. If it's a mini ATX, it'll only use the ones that say AM. And if it's a micro ATX, it will only use the ones that say AMI. Again, if you want more information on that, it will definitely be in the description. So because our motherboard is an ATX form factor, which means it's quite large, it's going to take up this entire space. So all of these standoffs that you can see down there, they're all the standoffs that are going to be used. But again, once we put the motherboard in there and start screwing it in, you'll see exactly what I mean. So first things first, we're going to take this IO cover that we got out of our motherboard case. We're going to rip this one open and we're going to get it mounted into the back panel of our case. So what this does is it sits like this, it gets pushed into the back here, pushed into place, ready for you to insert your motherboard. What you want to make sure is the orientation of the way this sits. So have a look at your motherboard, have a look at the way that it will sit in the back of the computer, and line this cover up to be in the same orientation before you push it into the back of the case. So for me, on this motherboard, all of the audio, which is these ones here, is down the very bottom, which means this is the correct orientation for it to go in. So we're just going to push it up towards the back. It'll fit there quite nicely and you'll feel it lock into place. Again, push on every corner, not too hard, but once it clips in, you'll see exactly what I mean. So now that shield's in there, you can see it just here, and that will sit flush to our motherboard once we screw that into our case. Now, a lot of cables that I have going into this case are coming from the back panel, through the little gaps, and into the front. So for the ease of mounting our motherboard, what I want to do is I want to take all of those cables out and feed them through just the back panel, just so it keeps the front of our case nice and open, ready for us to start mounting our motherboard. Alrighty, so it's time for us to start mounting our motherboard. Now, while handling your motherboard, try and be careful. I know that obviously it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but just try and be as careful as you can. What you want to do is you'll see some tiny little rings here on every specific part of where the standoffs get screwed. You want to put that onto the standoffs themselves and try your best to line up that back IO cover with where the motherboard is going to sit. Easy peasy. So that one's all set up, ready to go. What you want to do is get the screws that came with the case, and you want to screw these screws into every individual hole that has those rings around it where the standoffs will line up to the motherboard. Okay, so that one's all ready to go. Just before you turn your case up, make sure you have a quick little look and make sure exactly that everything is screwed in. The last thing you want is to not have screwed the motherboard in properly. It becomes loose, damages something. It's the last thing you want to do. So make sure it's all screwed in and then you're ready to flip up your case. Okay, we've mounted our motherboard. We've got everything ready to go. The next step is we need to install our power supply. Now, with most cases, you'll see that there is a slot in the back-end side for a power supply. Ours sits in this tiny little piece just here. We screw it in from the back, the cable goes in the back with the switch, and then all of the cabling gets done from the underside here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna install a power supply. I'm gonna put that in now and I'll show you what that looks like after we've installed it. Okay, so we've mounted the power supply. Now this power supply comes with these very colorful mustard and ketchup colored cables. They look atrocious, so I wanna try and hide those as best as I can. Obviously with this PC, it doesn't really matter too much because it's not gonna be looked at every day, but if you're gonna look at your PC and get annoyed that the cable's there and very exposed, then let's try our best to hide them. So before I try and attack anything to do with the power supply, I want to work with this mess here. So these are all of the cables that comes with the case. These are the cables for your USB 3 on the front of the case, your power switch, all of the fans that comes with it. This was honestly the most daunting thing for me when I first started building PCs, was thinking that I was gonna mess up all of the cabling that came with the case and the power supply, and that's what I thought I was gonna mess up, and that's what I thought was gonna damage the PC. I'm gonna show you really simply what you need to do. These fans do light up. You can change the color of these RGB lights as well. I'm not gonna have any RGB on this PC, which I know is probably blasphemy, but the aim of this PC is for a simulator, so we don't really want crazy lights showing at every moment of the day. So we're gonna try and make it as inconspicuous as we can. So first things first, what we wanna do is we wanna separate all of the cables. Let me move this into a better position for you. Now I wanna separate all of these cables so we know exactly what's going where and what cable does what. So I'm gonna move these ones to the side. We're gonna look here. We're gonna move these ones to the side because these are all one individual group. This one is a separate, put that to the side, and then these are all connected. So these ones here we can see because of this little connection, this SATA connection here, this is going to go straight into our power supply, and that will give power to all of the fans once the system's on. So we're going to leave that one down the bottom here because that makes the most sense to connect to the power supply once it's all ready to go. This one here, you can see, I don't know if you can really read it on that top camera, but they're all labeled. This one says HD audio. So this will plug into the bottom row of the motherboard that I showed you earlier. So I'm going to slip that right underneath. There's a little tiny gap that I can see underneath the case. I'm going to slip that right there. I can also see that these cables are labeled. Now I know that these are the power reset, the power on, and this is what tells the motherboard that you push the power button on the case and this actually engages the power on sequence. So we're going to thread this one as well through the same hole that we did with our HD audio, because again, it's going to go underneath that bottom row on the motherboard, but I'll show you that once we flip the case over. Moving on to this big one, it says here, USB 3.0. So I know I'm going to thread this one through the same hole because the USB 3.0 is on the bottom row as well. Now that we have all of those linked to that bottom channel, we know we're going to plug them into the motherboard. They're good to go. For the sake of keeping things nice and organized, I'm just going to tuck all of these fan cables into the bottom part of this for now, so I can flip this case over and have a look at the motherboard. Okay, so you can see here all of our cables made it through, so they're all scattered into this little area. Now what I want to do is plug in the first one that I grabbed, which is the USB 3.0, and I can see here on the USB 3.0, there's actually one corner that's blocked out. So the rest are pins, and this one's not got a pin slot. So when you look at the USB 3.0 port, you want to try and line up that blocked off pin with the pin that doesn't exist. You'll know exactly what I mean when you're looking at it, but that's an easy way to work out the orientation. All right, so that one's all plugged in and done. The next one is going to be the HD audio cable. So what you want to do is look into the motherboard and you'll see that it'll have labelings on the motherboard itself. For me, I can see the HD audio is in that bottom left-hand corner because the actual slot is labeled in bold lettering, audio. So we can again look for where the pin isn't and look for where the pin is missing, and that's how you're going to line it up. There you go, USB 3 and HD audio are all connected. Now this is where it gets to the trickier part. This is the one that always confused me. Now here you have your HD LED, negative and positive, power LED. This one here says power LED plus, so you've got negative and positive, your power switch, and this one here is your reset switch. These always confuse the heck out of me, but what you need to do is look inside your motherboard. Each one will be different. This one's actually really, really good. It's color coded with what does what, and there's a little key to tell you what colors represent what switches. All you need to do is line up what this says with what the motherboard is asking you to put in. That's it. If it says HD LED, you want to make sure that the negative side is on the right angle and push it in. So we're going to do that now and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, done. So I've plugged in all the power switch cables down there. We've got our HD audio and our USB 3. Our case is ready to flip. And what I can do is start pulling through those cables and just neatening things up a little bit. So I'll pull through the cables just to make it nice and neat in the front side of the case. We have a little bit of slack here. For the sake of the video, I'm just going to leave them here like this. But realistically, what you'd want to do, there are little loops here on the outer side of the case. You want to thread through like a cable tie or a Velcro tie or something along those lines just to hold those cables flush to the case and just make everything nice and neat. What we're gonna do now is work on our power supply cables, getting those all wired up and ready to go. Then all we have to do is install our M.2 and our graphics card, and this PC is ready to go. So before we start threading through a bunch of different cables into the case itself, you wanna sort of assess what cables you do need and what you can stuff inside the bottom of the case. So depending on the kind of power supply you're gonna get, there are gonna be a bunch of different connections. On all power supplies, you are gonna have a 24-pin connector, and as I said before, this one actually goes to the side of the motherboard, which helps power the entire thing. So we know exactly what that one does. You also have these flat kind of power supplies for things like hard drives, and you've also got these pin kind of power supplies which can sometimes power fans or other sort of things that require power from the power supply. Now because the main storage that we're actually using in this PC is an M.2, we actually don't need anything to power a 2.5 inch or a 3.5 inch hard drive that sits in your drive bay. So we can put all those aside, and we know that we need to have our CPU power pin, which goes at the very, very top, but I'll show you how to put that one in, your 24 pin, and you need your 6 or 8 pin connector for your GPU. Some GPUs or graphics cards will use different kinds of connectors. Some will only require a 6-pin, which is where your power supply will have this 6-pin piece, or you will have a 2-pin that you can attach to that 6-pin to make it an 8. Some graphics cards require more power, some don't. It completely depends on your system, but that's a really good way to see. You'll see on the graphics card itself, it'll have a 6-pin slot or an 8-pin slot. Depending on the kind of power supply you have, it will clip in and make a 6 to an 8. Very easy to understand. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna do our CPU power. Now, as I said, this one goes at the very, very top corner of the case here. So I'm just gonna thread that through for now so I can show you exactly how to plug that one in. I'm gonna do the same with the 24-pin connector. I like to run that right through the middle part here because 9 times out of 10, that is where the 24-pin connector is in on your motherboard. So again, I'm gonna put that through, pull it and just keep it there so I can show you how to plug it in. And then we're gonna need our graphics card power, which is gonna be this one here, which again, 6 or 8-pin piece. And what I'm gonna do is there's a tiny little slot at the back underneath where we put our 24-pin. I'm gonna put that cord right there. Obviously, each case is going to be different. Everyone's computer is going to be different. It depends on the system that you want to build. If this isn't applicable to yours, there are a bunch of different holes in a case that you can utilize. And again, this one is not going to be seen by the human eye. It's going to sit underneath a racing sim. So it doesn't really need to be as neat as what your build might be. So just take your time, try and get it as neat as you can, because I said, everybody's computers are going to be different. Now, before I stuff all of this excess power cabling underneath the case, we do have 3 fans in the front of this case, which come with this SATA connection point. I'm just gonna plug that one in, and now that that's plugged in, that's all ready to go and try and stash as much away as you can. And now, because I'm not gonna be using an internal hard drive, I'm gonna pull these drive bays out and I'm gonna store these away somewhere else so I can use all of that space to store my cabling. So now that we've got all of our cabling filtered through, we're gonna start with our CPU, which is in the top left-hand corner here. Now the cable comes through here, and I don't know how easy it's gonna be to see, but there's a little socket here that says ATX 12 volt, which means your CPU power. All you wanna do is line up those pins, get it nice and centered, and click it into place. And then that one's done. Easy peasy, squeezy lemons. We're gonna move on to the 24-pin connector, which is this brick here, and this is the cable. So same thing, you wanna pull it through, get it nice and lined up. You'll see that one side of these pins have a flat edge and one side has a rounded edge. So you wanna line the flat edge up with the flat edge inside the pin seat, which will look at something like this. Get it all lined up, click it into place. And again, same thing, you wanna push this one until it clicks, and that's how you know that they're seated correctly. Now we're pretty much all the way there. All we have to do is hook up the power to our GPU once that's laid in there. And we wanna also set up this fan. So this fan is the exhaust fan, as I mentioned earlier. It has a 3-pin connector because there isn't any RGB in this fan. So what we wanna do is we wanna look for something on the motherboard that says fan header, fan power, something along those lines. So I'm quite fortunate there is one right here. And again, all you wanna do is line up the back ridges of this connection will go straight into that panel. You'll see exactly what I mean when you're up and close with the motherboard, but you wanna make sure those fins line up to the back. So I'm gonna connect that one now. So now that that one's plugged in, it's all ready to go. All we have to do now is put our M.2 in, put in our graphics card, power the bad boy up, and then we see if the computer boots. So what we're gonna do first is install our M.2, because once the M.2 is in place in this spot, the graphics card will go in and actually cover where the M.2 is, which means we won't be able to install it first. So the M.2 that I've decided to go for is the SSD 980, which is a 1TB NVMe from Samsung. This is a really, really good one because it's a terabyte in capacity, which means everything that I have to do on this computer, I can store on this M.2. And because the read speed is about 3,500 megabytes per second, it'll make it nice and quick, and we won't have to rely too much on any sort of load time. So when you first get an M.2, you're gonna see there's 2 different edges. One edge has some pins and a notch, very similar to the way that our RAM goes, and the other side will have this sort of half moon on the end, and that is where you actually screw the screw into. So I'm just gonna set this aside for 1 second. We're gonna undo the screw for the mounting part, which is right here. So this is where we actually install it, and this is where we screw it down. So if you've never installed an M.2 before, it can be kind of daunting. I know the first time I did it was kind of intense. And the way you have to install them is you have to come down at a 45 angle and then push it down to screw in this side. I know it sounds weird, it's pretty counterintuitive, but I'll show you exactly what you need to do. Now, very similarly to RAM, you want to look for that notch and look where the notch is on the M.2 slot. If you don't know where the actual M.2 is, it might not be in this exact place for your motherboard. Look around the motherboard, you'll see the kind of connector, and it will say M.2 or NVMe right next to it. So we want to put that in. So there you go, that one's all installed. When you're putting it in, you want to wait for it to click, very similar to the RAM, and then you want to fasten a screw onto the other side to fit into the actual slot itself. So that's the M.2, all good to go. Again, we're going to pack up, make sure that all of those parts are away so we don't lose anything. And then we're going to open up our graphics card, get it all ready to go, and then fire this thing. So the graphics card we're going to use in this build is an RTX 2060. Now, when you install graphics card, when you first get it, you'll have this little black slip that will be over the pins to protect them. And you are going to have some little HDMI dummy pieces which you need to remove before you can plug any cables into there, which is totally fine. Now, when you look at where you want to install your graphics card, for us, it's going to be in this top slot here. And if you look right to the left-hand side, you can see that there's actually these covers. So what that does is covers up the slot where the graphics card is going to sit. So we want to roughly line it up, and we can see that it's going to be covered by this one slot. The last one that was in this case used these two slots, whereas this one is going to use this one and the one underneath. So before we can install our graphics card, what we need to do is take out this PCIe cover. Very, very simply, you want to unscrew. Once you undo that screw, the PCIe cover piece will actually just pull out, and then you're ready to go. You want to grab your graphics card, you want to locate where it is actually going to go. Now, on all PCIe slots, you actually have this tail, very similar to the way that the RAM locks in. You want to make sure that this is pushed down, ready to go to install your graphics card. Now, you're going to look at the notches. You can only really go one way because this panel goes towards the back of the computer. You're going to line it up, and once you've got it lined up, you want to give it a bit of a push down until you hear that click. And once you look to the left-hand side here, you'll see that there's holes that line up to where that PCIe cover screw actually sat before. So you're going to get that screw that you removed, put it through the hole into that area, and you're going to screw it in to help fasten down the GPU. Now it's going to sit in there and it's nice and stiff. This one can actually have two screws help hold it in, so I'm going to install both of them just to keep it as stiff as we can without really having any flex in the CPU at all. Easy. So the graphics card is in, everything's good to go. Now we want to use this GPU power cable. Now, as I said, this one doesn't really need to look very pretty, so I'm not going to try and think too hard about how I want to put this graphics card in, but 9 times out of 10, you can put it in over the top, just like this. You want to push it until it clicks in, and then you can pull it back into the case and try and help hide as much of it as you can. And that's it. That's literally all ready to go. We have our CPU and CPU cooler installed. It's powered at the CPU, 24-pin connector, and our GPU. We have our USB 3, our HD audio, as well as our power switch all hooked up, ready to go. Our RAM is installed, our fan is installed into the motherboard, and these ones are installed into the back of the case. The power supply is all ready to go. So what I'm gonna do is clean up a little bit. We're gonna plug it in, and we're gonna see if it boots. Okay, I've got it all set up. I've got a monitor just here, got our keyboard plugged in, ready to go. I've got the power supply plugged in. I'm gonna quickly flick the switch. We now have power coming to the motherboard. This is a good start. All right, I'm gonna push the power button on the case and see if it starts up. There we go. It's running. It's starting. Let's see if we can get it to boot. So now that we know that it works, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn it off, turn it back on, get into the BIOS, and see if everything's being picked up as it should be. We can see that it's picking up our RAM, it's picking up what graphics card we're using, what chip we're using. It can see everything. Everything is good to go. Perfect. So now we have a completely functional running PC. So all you need to do now is insert a USB like this. This has a copy of Windows on it, so you can boot from this USB, install it onto the system, and then you take out the USB and you restart the computer and boot from where you installed this to. I'm not gonna show you how to do that. I'll probably do that in another video, but I will leave a bunch of links that will show you exactly how to do that in the easiest way possible. And then you're ready to go. You jump into the system, you activate your version of Windows 10, and you have a computer. It's finished, it's done, you did it. Good job. Now, completely all jokes aside, I hope This was the easiest way for you to understand how to build a PC. We went through everything from start to finish, your CPU cooler, motherboard, everything along the way. I hope that I explained it in the easiest way possible. If I didn't, I'm so sorry, and please leave me a comment below. I'm happy to help you out as best as I can. If you liked this video or found it helpful in any way, don't forget to leave it a thumbs up. Also, subscribe. I make videos every week and you don't want to miss out on them. If you want to join us on any other social media, it is at The Game Department. You can pretty much find us everywhere from Instagram to TikTok to Twitter. You can find us on pretty much everything with a search bar. If Discord is more your vibe and you want to hang out with a bunch of amazing people, we talk about games, we talk about memes, we talk about how shiny my forehead is now that the hair gets tied up. I'll leave a link to our server below. You should definitely come and check it out. If you have any questions on this build or you want to ask me in real time, I stream on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 4:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. You should definitely come and say hello. I'm more than happy to talk about any of the videos that you find here on YouTube. Also, tell me you found us on YouTube. That would be cool. Other than that, guys, I'm gonna leave you to it. I hope you had a good morning. I hope you have a good night. Bye!